Okay, welcome to the CARE Conference 2021 panel discussion on implementation issues. My name is Jeremy Deaton. I'm the managing editor at Yale Environment 360, and I will be moderating today's panel. We're going to get into some real important questions related to implementation. What does sustainable investing mean? How do you measure it? How do you know if a firm you're investing in is behaving sustainably? How should we adapt our accounting practices for sustainable investing? And we have a great lineup of experts to help us answer some of those questions. Joining us today, Natalie Ambrosio-Preudhomme, a director at 427, part of Moody's ESG Solutions. Paul Druckman, chairman of the Supervisory Board of the World Benchmarking Alliance. Jason Huang, managing director of the Quantitative Investment Department at eFunds. Andrew Watson, co-founder of Rethinking Capital. And Zhang, managing principal at Apricus Climate Ventures, excuse me. So as a way of introduction, I want to share a story that I recently reported to kind of highlight why we're talking about these issues right now. In addition to my work with Yale Environment 360, I'm also a regular contributor to the Washington Post covering climate and energy. A few months back, I did a story on a climate risk startup named Jupiter Intel that had seen its business drop off during the pandemic, like most companies. And then in the months at the end of 2020 and the start of 2021, saw its business boom, and suddenly it had 10 times as much business as it had before the pandemic. And I talked to the CEO about that and talked to other folks in the industry about that, including Natalie. And kind of the read of the situation was that because of the pandemic, because a lot of businesses, lending institutions, has seen this catastrophic risk disrupt the financial sector, disrupt the economy. People were paying attention to other big risks. And climate change is at the top of that list. Climate change poses a massive threat along numerous dimensions to the financial sector. On top of that, you also had new interest from regulators, from central banks in climate risk. And I think that this issue is really having a moment right now. I think that this is a great time to be talking about this, how we protect our businesses from climate risk, how we invest sustainably. And that is the last I'm going to say about that before I hand off this discussion to our experts. To begin, I'd like to talk to Natalie, who works in climate risk. Natalie, maybe you can tell us, what are some of the challenges of using physical climate data for financial decision making?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jeremy, for the introduction, and thank you all for having me. As Jeremy mentioned, I'm a director at 427, which is a physical climate risk analytics firm, and is now part of the new Moody's ESG Solutions group. And yeah, as Jeremy alluded to, physical risk and understanding of physical risk and resilience is a key element when we're talking about sustainable businesses, sustainable economies. A key part of sustainability is being resilient to the increasing extreme events driven by climate change, as well as other things like pandemics and whatnot. And so to answer your question around the risks of, the challenges of leveraging climate data to understand these risks, I'll start by laying out three of these challenges and then briefly talking about how we work to address those challenges. So the first thing I'll mention is that there is ample climate risk data out there from global climate models projecting detailed estimates of precipitation and temperature changes out to the end of the century. However, these are massive files that require specialized computing power. They have different units from degrees of temperature, millimeters of precipitation, what have you, and there are different levels of granularity. So these are not data sets that financial stakeholders are ready to ingest and use for decision making. The second challenge is that for physical risk exposure, the impacts on a company are going to be based on whether their underlying facilities are exposed. So whether or not their manufacturing plants, their data centers, the sites where the operations actually take place are exposed to extreme climate-driven events. And so that requires an understanding of where these precise locations of these facilities are. And then Thirdly, of course, by definition, climate risks are getting worse into the future. So we cannot rely on the past to project what the future conditions might look like. So therefore, decision-useful climate risk information has to be forward-looking, while also being as granular as possible to be location-specific, but also still globally comparable, so it can be used for decision-making and risk assessment in portfolios with thousands of companies, as an example. So how we've addressed some of these challenges is to develop an analytic scoring approach for physical climate risk that focuses on addressing these challenges. It ingests the latest available climate science from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and other research bodies to produce forward-looking outputs that are also useful for financial decision-making. So we provide risk scores for floods, hurricanes and typhoons, heat stress, sea level rise, water stress, and wildfires. And we do that by looking at several underlying indicators for each hazard, really meant to capture different dimensions of how this hazard will manifest into risk, including both absolute risk and relative risk compared to a location-specific historical baseline. So for example, for floods, we capture the severity and frequency of historical flood events at a specific location, but also the frequency of projected future heavy rainfall events and the intensity of prolonged periods of heavy rainfall. And these indicators are based on outputs from global climate models, as well as additional specialized data sets that simulate extremes that could happen in the future based on local rainfall regime and topography. So really integrating a variety of different indicators, but then having a simple 0 to 100 output as well as risk thresholds so that this data can be integrated into financial analysis. And so for companies, we run this scoring assessment at the facility level for a database of about 2 million corporate facilities globally. And then we aggregate that data up to the company level. So we have a company level view of climate risk, but it's really driven by the location of the underlying facilities and their exposure. And we then supplement that with data on market risk and supply chain risk at the sector level to try to provide a holistic view of physical risk exposure across the value chain. And this data can be used by investors for risk management, complying with disclosure regulation, as well as importantly, engaging with the companies that they find in their portfolio that are exposed to high risk and engaging around their risk exposure and potential resilience. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Natalie. You know, one thing you mentioned is that you make use of a lot of the academic research in your models, and it seems like there's a real symbiotic relationship here between the private sector and academia. What are some future areas for research for private sector companies like yours and for academics, and are there opportunities for collaboration?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a huge area of research and potential collaboration opportunities. And first, I just want to mention that the fact that the need for very granular location-specific data remains a huge challenge for lenders and investors. So while the science has advanced that we can have granular projections of increases in extremes at specific locations, there's definitely a need that investors and banks are really understanding that they need to improve their understanding of the precise locations of assets underlying their loans and investments. And improved corporate disclosure can really help with this. And I mention that because that is an area of research from academics I know, as well as the industry as a whole. And additionally, connecting the very granular climate risk data that I'm talking about to economic, financial, and credit risk measures is really the next really important step into actually integrating climate risk management into the financial sector's daily processes. And we in the private sector, in collaboration with Moody's Analytics, have been making a lot of exciting progress in this space. They have integrated climate risk measures like those I've just talked about into their well-used and well-tested EDF model to come up with climate-adjusted probability of defaults for companies over several scenarios over many years. And so that's an example of how this is being integrated directly into the credit risk modeling. And there's many more areas that we're working on, macroeconomic models and others. So that's a space of really important developing research. And I would say there's definitely room and a need for academic research conducting studies to help us understand the financial impacts of climate risk. So one example is conducting event studies to explore the impact that climate-driven events have had on various financial variables, both at the company level or at the macro level. And data like this is really important because it helps price the cost of climate risk and helps understand really what is exposed in the financial sector in terms of this systemic risk, which also helps make the case for the need for resilience investment. It's clear that there's a large opportunity for investing in resilience, but it's in order to really have pickup from investors in this opportunity, really sizing that opportunity is essential, which is another important element of research, is sizing the return on investment for investing in resilience, as well as developing approaches and guidelines for companies to assess and disclose not only their risk, which is definitely a developing area of much research, and there have been a lot of developments in the risk disclosure space recently, but the next really important step is disclosing their resilience efforts in a consistent, some sort of comparable way, and investors being able to leverage that alongside risk, because it's becoming quite clear that one can't really divest from physical climate risk exposure. Everyone in the world is exposed to physical hazards in one way or another. And so looking at this in terms of understanding risk, balancing it in portfolios, but then leveraging that understanding to engage and figure out how best to prepare for the impacts is really essential. And there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done as far as understanding the resilience is so qualitative, really location specific, depends on a lot of variables, and having great thinkers and time spent really understanding how do we digest this, how do we connect the gap between companies and investors, allow for comparable analysis of resilience is something that's really important. And so, yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. So, you talked a lot about climate risk and companies having a new interest in this. And from what I understand, a lot of the interest has been driven by some recent moves from regulators. I want to turn now to Paul. Paul, your expertise is essentially in corporate reporting and governance. I'm wondering if you can maybe help us understand some of the significant changes by regulators and also explain how you think some of these implementation issues are being addressed.
Thank you, Jeremy. And as with Natalie, thank you for asking me to speak on this important issue. I'm going to break it down, if I can, into addressing implementation issues in corporate reporting and also a direction of travel. So on the former, I think that one of the key issues is around the audience and materiality is the ever-growing matter that people find difficult to implement in their cycle. And really, to my mind, it's what companies need to do is to have a clarity of their stakeholder materiality map. In other words, just how material different stakeholders are. And a great example of this is actually the ACCA integrated report, where they map out all their different stakeholders. And I think that would be, if anybody's interested in that aspect, that'd be a good one to look at. The second implementation issue that often comes to the fore is with all these diverse voluntary reporting frameworks and standards out there, can they be brought together? Well, the answer is yes, but only with significant insight, innovation, and resources within the organization. Again, just giving people an example, if you take a look at Itaú Unibanco, the largest bank in South America, they've done a phenomenal job at incorporating all the key frameworks and standards in their reporting suite. And then the third thing that people are struggling with is the bridging from ESG, which is the aspect most focused on at the moment, and mainly through this conference, to the SDGs, to the Sustainable Development Goals. Great efforts are being made. Again, if you look at the reporting suite of Mitsubishi Corporation in Japan, you'll see that that they've tried to do this and have made quite a success, but aren't there yet. But what we do need in this bridge between SDGs and ESG is an accountability mechanism for the SDGs, which really, Jeremy, leads me on to the direction of travel. So again, breaking this down into three parts, the European Union with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive of 2021, it does give a broader ESG leading to impact, sort of, if I put it in brackets, sort of GRI style reporting. And that is going to be implemented at a European level in the future. Then the IFRS Foundation, which has underneath it at the moment the International Accounting Standards Board, who produce the financial statements other than in the US. There's only there's US GAAP, and then the rest of the world uses IFRS. They are creating an International Sustainability Standards Board to create sustainability standards. Now, it looks like that's going to be focused very much on current ESG thinking. And you might gather from what I've said before that I worry, and I'm borrowing a quote from somebody else, but there's the worry that ESG is a giant societal placebo. In other words, we think we know that we're doing, we think we're doing well, but actually, are we really in what we're achieving? So I think that's another aspect, and but nonetheless, that again will be implemented with the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, being created during this year. Just going back to what I talked about, an accountability mechanism for the SDGs, that's what we do at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we're in the process of completing benchmarks and rankings, not to shareholders, not to investors, but to society, to understand the true impact on biodiversity, inequality, and what Natalie was talking about and seems to be the focus of most capital market speak, is the climate change agenda. So there's an awful lot happening, and it's a very exciting time. I've been in this world a long time, and I have to say that although some things are new, both the European Union and IFRS will be regulated reporting, mandatory reporting, and that's a big, big win.
That's great. Paul, I want to ask you the same question I asked Natalie, essentially, which is, what do you see as the role of academia and addressing some of these implementation issues?
Okay, well, being married to a academic professor, I have an insight into some of these things, although not in accounting, she isn't. But I'm afraid much of my thought is not really about research, to which I apologize to many academics, but it's about educating the finance community. And that's from undergraduates to MBAs to the professional qualifications, and on from professional qualification to continuing professional development. There needs to be a focus not on the past or on the current, but on the future role of accounting for capital markets within a viable planet. I mean, there are some terrific examples. If you look at the Accounting for Sustainability team, they have a CFO leadership network, which not only helps to the CFOs of these large corporations to understand what needs to be done, but also their teams as well to be educated. And I think, some of the things I've seen when I've spoken to MBA students especially is still a lot of the same talking about value to shareholders rather than the responsibility of business within a society and a planet that isn't sustainable, isn't resilient, Natalie, in your speak.
That's a great answer, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it's, as you said, it's not just the contributions of research, but also the way we talk about these issues and think about these issues. Relatedly, I want to turn to Jason now. Jason, you work on environmental, social, and governance investing. ESG investing has become really important to investment decisions in China. And I'm curious how you're undertaking ESG investing in your work.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, while at its early stage, ESG investing become more and more important in China. Just for example, just a few days ago, officials from the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission of the State Council mentioned that the council would proactively promote the inclusion of ESG in evaluating companies' efforts in undertaking social responsibilities and achieving the sustainable development. So as a leading asset management firm in China, eFunds also sees more and more investment mandates that more or less include certain ESG-related requirements. So we believe, eFunds as the firm believes that ESG responsible investing is the right investment philosophy. There's no doubt about that. But that means we take the social value of a public firm as important as its economy value. However, to get ESG investing into our investment process, there are two important components. The first one is our IT infrastructure, and the second one is the business procedures that can get the responsible investing into our investment decision-making process. So first, let me talk about a little bit about the IT infrastructure. So eFunds in the last few years, we already take great efforts to build up our own proprietary ESG investing platform, which is called ARC ESG. So based on the machine learning and AI technologies, the platform can cover all the 4,000 plus listed companies and 99% of the credit bond issuers in China. So it's a great platform. So, and it would be a continuous effort to improve the platform on the in the ongoing basis. And then on the business procedure side, ESG, in order to get involved into our investment process, there are 4 sub-processes which can support that. They are ESG assessment process, exclusion process, public firm monitoring and engagement process, and the last one is the proxy. So let me explain them a little bit. The ESG assessment process is a process to examine the ESG indicators generated from our platform. We try to identify the potential or significant issues from the public companies through the combination of quantitative and qualitative research. And the exclusion process is based on the ESG assessment results and the fundamental research from our research team to generate a blacklist of firms that are against our ESG standards. So our research has shown that the exclusion portfolio would consistently and significantly underperforms, which means it generates great negative alpha. The third process is a public firm monitoring and engagement process. Based on our ESG assessment, we might actively engage with the public firms that we have holdings to discuss their potential issues and our suggestions that what we believe the right things to do. So we will continuously follow up with the firms to ensure the management are taken seriously and address the issues correctly. If not, we might just let go our holdings. And lastly is the proxy, which is a very powerful tool to ensure the management listening to shareholders' voices. We diligently exercise the right for the best benefit of our investor and the social responsibilities. So through the full process, we try our best to ensure our investments are aligned with the responsible investing standards. And it may also help our investment our investee companies understand that they should conduct their business in a sustainable way by undertaking social responsibilities. I stop here, Jing.
Yeah, very good. You mentioned that you were seeing mandates for ESG investing, so hopefully we'll see more of this. But what are some of the potential difficulties that you see in the future with ESG investing?
Yeah, I think there's no free lunch here, and there are definitely difficulties in ESG investing at this stage, especially in China. And I will talk about it from two perspectives. One is from my side as a player from an asset management firm, and also from the public companies we are investing. So first, from the perspective of an asset management firm, we learned that it's quite costly to build our ESG platform. And that is given the requirement that the amount of human resources and the computing power it requires. And then I found that we lack of quality data. And thank you for Natalie to just introduce a new data vendor. And we found that in China, I don't have very good quality data that can be used to fulfill our requirements of ESG assessment. I'm glad to see that there are quite a few data vendors who have made great progress in the last few years, but I believe the qualities could be improved further. And also the data is expensive and not quite easily accessible. And lastly, from my viewpoint, and I think it's very important, that ESG investing so far has shown to generate great negative alpha to help us avoid investing in companies that are under the bar. But as a portfolio manager, I would be more happy to see that more positive alpha can be generated to help improve our investment returns. And as the quant team at eFunds, we are working very hard on this now. And I hope that we will make more progress in the near future. And then let me switch my angle and talk a little bit from the listed firms. When we talk to the firms, and honestly, we feel their pains. To fulfill the ESG standards, they may have to invest heavily on their infrastructures. For example, a chemical firm, they may have to spend much in upgrading their pollution reduction systems. And furthermore, just like Paul just mentioned about the responsible reporting, it is not a simple process, especially for the industries. And it could be very costly to fulfill the mandatory reporting requirements. So from their viewpoint, they all see the burdens, but should they see the benefit upfront, I think there will be a trade-off here. So in short, I believe ESG investing is more than just the asset management from all the companies. I think the effort from our regulatory bodies, such as better tax benefits, streamline or standardize the responsible reporting, and also making more and better ESG-related data accessible. I think all this could be very helpful.
I'll move to Jing next and talk about climate disclosures. Jing, maybe you can tell us what can we learn from the current voluntary climate disclosures, and maybe also you can tell us a bit about some of the research done on TCFD disclosures.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to draw upon my panelist remark in answer these questions. The first point is that, as Paul mentioned, that most likely there will be a global mandatory reporting standard emerging under the leadership of IFRS Foundation, which I think is great development. There are a number of volunteer standards currently in place by organizations such as Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, Global Reporting Initiative, Carbon Disclosure Project, and the Task Force on Financial Disclosure, Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, Climate Disclosure Standard Board, and International Integrated Reporting Councils. And these organizations have done great amount of work and provide a solid conceptual foundation for the incoming global standard. And organizations like Rethinking Capital also playing important role in that. There are a lot of companies have already been disclosing a great deal of information using these volunteer standard. And I think we can learn a lot from the standard as well as the implementation for both the benefit for developing the new global mandatory standard, as well as for the eventual implementation of the mandatory standard. So I'm going to just use the TCFD as an example to highlight a few points. First is that I'm going to call out, given that the CARE is an academic conference, I'm going to call out that there have been a very few academic studies in the accounting literature on the subject, perhaps due to a number of challenges. The first one is maybe it's lack of awareness of the importance of the topic challenge, of the specific topic, as well as the complexity of these standards. As you can see that when I listed all these current standard organizations, it's a mouthful, right? And probably the biggest challenge, as have been alluded by Natalie, Paul, and Jason, is perhaps really around data. So if you look at the TCFD disclosure information, today, these disclosures are all over the places. It could be in their 10K, it could be in their ES3 report, it could be in their press release, etc. It's just not easy to actually access these data items in a centralized electronic format. In fact, the very few study on this topic, their first step had always been actually spending tremendous amount of resource collecting these data from this diverse range of sources and standardize them and put it into a useful format. And there's a tremendous amount of work involved, and involving some of the newer technique, for example, using natural language processing, processing non-structured data, right? So the first step is about data. And for the few studies to actually overcome the challenge of data, I think there are a number of points I would like to make. And probably the two biggest one is materiality, as Paul alluded to, and comparability of the information in these disclosures. And on the comparability, it's my experience directly involved in some of these research, as well as looking at some of the very limited number of research in this area. It's very, very difficult to compare the disclosure across the companies, as well as even time series wise, from one report to the next. So this speaks to the, the standardization, the global standard. And so solving the materiality and the comparability of the information is critical for the new standard. The next point I want to make is that if we want to make these standards meaningful in terms of changing behavior, make it concrete, we really need to understand the connection between the disclosed information with outcome, such as financial performance or some sort of exposed ESG events. I think Jason already alluded to that, buy-side firms, asset managers, they're trying to understand the exposed performance of the investment in these companies with ESG disclosure information. So I think that's a nascent area of research, and there's a lot of work need to be done in this area, and it's a very fruitful area for research. Let me pause here, Jeremy, and see if any areas you want me to elaborate on or any additional question.
No, I think everything you said is very thorough. I do want to pivot though and get your thoughts on a different topic and ask you what you think we can learn from the implementation of new accounting standards that have been enacted after the global financial crisis.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question. I had been quite involved in one of the standards that enacted after the great financial crisis, namely the so-called IFRS 9 for the international standard. The US equivalent is called CECL. At a high level, that standard was designed to rectify the problem of loan loss reserve, that it was too late, too little during the great financial crisis. Now, if you look at how that standard came about and the timing and the process, so that standard was first proposed around 2009, and it took about 4 or 5 years to finalize that standard. And it took another 4 or 5 years to implement. So from starting point to in the case of US, CECL became effective January 2020. So on average, it had taken, let's say, around 10 years. And the first comment I want to make is that, frankly, we don't have 10 years to work on this. I don't mean this to be a criticism of the IFRS and CECL standard. It's just very complex. And by the way, any new accounting standard, it does take a certain process of getting feedback, getting inputs, and obviously the implementation, it takes a lot of resources, iteration, etc. So I don't want to belittle the effort. But the first point I want to really make is talking about the urgency about this. The second point I want to make is that I hope that this time around we'll have a truly global standard, unlike what happened with IFRS 9 and CECL. And quickly, last time around, initially, everybody was pushing for a standard. And at some point, there was a bifurcation between the international standard and the US standard. And I will not get into the details why that was the case, but there are justifications and reason behind that. But the bifurcation of the standard indeed has created quite a bit of a problem in this case. So I hope that this time around we truly will have a global standard. And also in that context, using that example, I think all things equal, we should go for the simpler proposal. So in the case of IFRS 9 versus CECL, CECL was actually a simple proposal than IFRS 9. Another point I want to make in terms of the helping frame the standard, and there will be unintended consequences, and there will be a lot of discussion, feedback about these unintended consequences. And indeed, that's the case, and it's unavoidable. And I hope this time around, we will not let the argument and the debate, the discussion about unintended consequence derail the overall objective, which is we're trying to put out the standard. Hopefully that will help speed up the process. Next, I'll just quickly make some comments about the implementation. I think all my panelists have made a number of very important points about data. I cannot emphasize that enough. And this is especially true that given the fact that the standard, the global monetary standard hasn't been truly finalized, institutions don't have to wait for the finalization of the standard to start the journey, and especially on the data part, collecting data, getting the external data, et cetera, et cetera. And this take a long, long time. And institutions should not wait the finalization of standard to start on this journey. And similarly apply to the technology. And the last point I want to make is that even though we can treat this as accounting disclosure exercise, there are tremendous benefits that we can make out of this exercise on top of accounting. And if indeed we try to tie the reporting, the metrics to other business decision, and that will make the exercise more meaningful. Let me pause here.
I think that's very well said. Thanks for your thoughts on that. I think that actually sets us up very nicely to move on to our last speaker, Andrew, who's going to be batting cleanup for us today. Andrew, I want to talk to you a bit about accounting practices. We've transitioned away from an industrial economy, but we're still using the same accounting practices. And I know you think that's a problem. Maybe you can tell us what's wrong with the old accounting practices.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. Excuse me. I've got a bit of hay fever, so I might cough a little bit. I think it's interesting when you listen to everybody. I'm brand new to this whole area, in which case, actually, from my point of view, I find it terribly confusing. If you ask me about intangibles, I can talk about intangibles all day long. But when I hear these sort of conversations, I literally I can't really tune into the language. And maybe, I guess what I would come at is to ask a question: how do you make this simple? Are we making it too complicated? And I think if you want to do that, my father was an engineer, and he always used to talk about actually go and find what the root cause of the problem is, and then actually go and fix the root cause. So let me try and go there. So as you said, Jeremy, the economy's changed. We've moved from an industrial economy to an intangible economy, but all the rules that govern the economy haven't kept up. Whether it's economics or the theory of the firm or accounting, none of the rules have kept up. It's actually the third time in history this has happened. There's a book by my co-founder, Robert McGarvey, called Futuromics, and it describes that actually this is the third time in the history of Western capitalism this sort of total shift of the foundations of the economy occurs. But the way that the same pattern repeats is that actually the economy changes first, then all of its rules only later adapt. So we're in this transitional phase. That's the way that Rethinking Capital thinks about it. But interestingly, if you follow the pattern of history, double entry bookkeeping was the catalyst for recognition of assets in those first two revolutions. And this is where I think where you start to realize it can be made simple. Let's see though how illogical accounting practice has made the world as things stand right now. Accounting practice, and I keep stressing accounting practice, not the standards, is so illogical that it punishes the good guys. And the better behaved the good guys are, the more it punishes them, and it rewards the bad guys. And the worse behaved the bad guys are, the more it rewards them. So basically what you've got is a system of incentives which is entirely upside down. But interestingly also, the mindset's upside down. I mean, I describe it actually, I'm a father of 5. If I'd used that mode of discipline to discipline my children, that I reward the guys who behave really badly and I actually, punish the guys who behave well, what sort of system do you think you work in? It's chaotic. And we therefore think this is all behavioral. Interestingly, and this is sort of the expertise or the idea. So again, I could sort of go on root cause. What actually is therefore the root cause of the problem? The root cause of the problem also is that accounting, as it hasn't kept up, has, well, the rumors are, or the estimates are, $108 trillion of intangible value is not on balance sheets. It's like a warehouse of gold, and you've never recognized any of it. And the problem with accounting is you can't come and recognize some of it now. It's just growing and growing. But then on the other shed that you own, actually, there's a hole. And the hole started quite small, but actually it's just got so big now and it's so deep. You can't then start to recognize the intangible liabilities, we call them, because you've never done so in the past. So it's interesting to us coming at this from an entirely different direction to anybody else. We believe that that then describes what the root cause of the problem is. Challenge then goes, how do you solve it? Shall I keep on going, Jeremy? Is that all right? If I just keep
going? Keep rolling on.
The answer is accounting. It's actually pretty simple. So let me just tell you how our work works. So if you imagine that we wrote a case study on BP called Constrained by Accounting. And imagine that BP is repurposing many of its 10,000 engineers to solve problems like carbon capture. All the costs associated with all of that and those years of expertise are written off as a cost to claim a tax deduction, strangely. And they always have been. So people and all the skills and expertise that you're using to specify new solutions are considered a cost. And therefore, actually, they're a penalty. What Rethinking Capital says is that's wrong. They're not a cost. You're creating something of value. And therefore, what we say is actually what those organizations are doing is investing into their balance sheet. And the asset that they're investing into is your social license. So you're taking something from being a cost on the income statement to being an increase in shareholder equity and profitability. Every pound that you take off the cost line goes across to being an increase in shareholder equity and profitability. It flips the incentives. It, in theory, and we'll work out this when we get to proof of concept, we hope in September, it flips the mindset. We start systematically rewarding people for doing the right thing. This is only net zero. It applies to all sustainability investments. We're going to look at well-being as well. So it flips the incentives. And interestingly for us, and I am going to be controversial, it gives the accountants a way out. It's a very simple first implementation. You do not change the existing financial statements. You leave those as are. And all you do is use this concept, it's called normative accounting for intangibles, to create a decision-making framework that we think will be made, governed. So it comes back to one of Paul's points about, we need a standard governance for these things, and that's what we're trying to work out with our proof of concept community. You have decision-making made using this, and then you have decision reporting using TCFD. So the accountants need a way out. There's a fairly controversial statement for an accounting conference, but this is literally no more than what we're using. We're using normative accounting theory. So this is for the accountants in the audience. Normative accounting theory, which goes back to the 1950s. It says, look at the user, look at the user's decision. There are many alternative fair views of a company. And we apply that to intangibles. We're using GAAP, we're using double entry bookkeeping. We're going to do what Paul Druckman will find exciting. We're going to actually update Pacioli and do triple entry bookkeeping to look at the societal elements. And then we're using existing standards, IS 37, IS 38, and that creates a decision logic that can be used to enable organizations to actually make decisions. And actually, this becomes a whole exercise in building shareholder equity.
Very well said. That's really interesting stuff and really exciting stuff. I think we have time for just one more question. I want to put this to the panel. We're just going to go in the order that we've just spoken in. So we'll start with Natalie. I want to ask you guys, what are some questions that academics should be answering, some issues they should be tackling, some directions for future research? I know that we've kind of touched on this at a couple different points in the panel today, but I just want to reiterate on any points that people tuning in today might take a closer look at. And extra points for our panelists if your idea gets someone tenure. So we'll start with Natalie.
Yeah, I already mentioned a bit of this, and I will just highlight that, of course, this is CARE, the accounting conference, but we do rely on academic research from scientific research to fuel our data sets and engage closely with those communities. So for anyone in that community listening, just understanding the manifestation of physical climate risk is a huge necessary field of research. But back to the financial element, I definitely mentioned quantifying the financial risks of climate change, having studies that specifically look at certain events, helping us understand how the exposure to an extreme wildfire or flood actually translates into observed financial impact. I'll also mention, and Jing touched on this, the research with disclosures. And we have had researchers leverage our data on observed or modeled climate risk exposure and compare that to what companies are actually disclosing as far as their risk goes, and also their risk management, which is, I think, a really important element of research to, again, start teasing out how the disclosures can improve what they're actually telling us. And then I'll just leave again on that note of we need good thinkers thinking through resilience, how to measure it, how to implement it, and connect these dots.
Well said. Paul, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to stay consistent with what I said earlier. And what I've never seen, although it may be there, Jeremy, is anything that actually some research on just how much expertise is there in the accounting and finance profession for the new world. Yeah, just are we training people the same, or are we actually starting to move them into a clearer understanding of what value, what Andrew talked about, and many of the rest of us have talked about in terms of understanding value, not just in its old form?
That's a great question. I'm going to put that on a bumper sticker. Jason, Jason, what do you think?
Just followed Paul. Yeah, it takes 7 days to build a world, right? So maybe we are in the day one of the new world. But I'm kind of saying there's no doubt that that's the good thing or the right thing to do for the future. And from the investment side, I believe that we have the responsibility, or we also have the capacity to guide the social resources toward the responsible investing or the social responsibility. But just like what I mentioned, I'm seeing the difficulties, but I'm also kind of encouraged by the speakers today that we are seeing the new accounting standards, which may be a good way for us to have standardized, accessible data to analyze the company from accounting side. And I also believe that we have the right technology in these days. The next thing is that how we're already in the digital era, and how we can leverage the technology to accumulate the right data for our analysis. And that's what we call alternative data for our investments. And I look forward to that as well. I believe with all of that, we can not only to identify the firms which can fulfill their social responsibility and also be recognized for by both the investment industry or the society. In that case, I believe the firm will have a bright future, and I believe that will become a more and more important component of our investment philosophy. And I believe eFunds will continue to do that. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, definitely. Jing, let's turn to you.
Right. So let me just answer that question this way. If I were a PhD candidate choosing a dissertation topic, or if I were a newly minted academic trying to get my tenure, I cannot find a better topic than this one, this area. Or if I want to actually go to industry, work with somebody like Jason, go to buy side. And because I cannot think of better combination than this topic with in terms of real impact to the world. Two, the range of the technique you have to deploy and learn, from climate science to finance, accounting, to machine learning, AI. And the third one is just the applicability of what you're going to get out of this in terms of applications, etc. So I'm very bullish. I hope that we have convinced you about the bullish of the case in this. And I have a lot of personal interest, and feel free for the audience, if you want to reach out to me, feel free. I have a lot of ideas of potential research topic. Be happy to collaborate.
That's fantastic. We love bullishness. And we'll go to Andrew now for any last words.
Sure. We would love to have a group of around about 5 open-minded, progressive accounting academics who would love to help us to rethink accounting for this economy, but also to solve, social imperatives like net zero. I stumbled into this area in 2017, and actually was incredibly blessed to find some superb technical accountants that have actually gathered around us to help us to sort the complexity out. So I describe them that we've already got a community that's like the Rolling Stones. We need the Rolling Stones because actually people will no doubt challenge that you can use existing standards. You can use existing GAAP. You can actually update double entry bookkeeping. Jason, Justin and I talked, and we haven't got time to have another, whatever it is, 10 years to create another standard. I'm not going to wait that long. So actually, I think if we can use what's already there, we should try our utmost to do so. And so I'd love to find 5 young, hungry, progressive accountants who'd love to renew accounting for this economy and solve. Net zero is just one application of this, etc. Anyway, I could go on forever, Jeremy. As everybody who knows me, actually, I really am struggling to talk for less than an hour about a thing that I have a real passion for. But thank you for listening to me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, very good. I'm sure that there will probably be folks here who want to ring you up and have you talk their ears off. We're going to leave it there for today. I want to thank all of our brilliant panelists, Natalie, Paul, Jason, Jing, and Andrew, and for sharing your thoughts and your expertise. And obviously, I want to thank everyone who tuned in today to watch the panel. And we'll see you at the next panel for the CARE conference. Thank you.